November in the Cascade Mountains of the Pacific Northwest was a relentless, cold monochrome. The world was cast in 50 shades of gray, the only contrast the rusty mud clinging fiercely to the soles of their boots. Elijah Vance, a senior park ranger who had spent 40 years in this wilderness, knew the November routine well. These were heavy, wet days when fog settled on the peaks like thick, spilled cream, and icy water seeped from every rock, a constant reminder that nature was powerful and infinitely patient. Today, he led the morning patrol deep into the area known as the Red Canyon. The canyon was named not for its rocks, but for the color of the moss that grew particularly thick there, though now the canyon, like everything else, was simply gray. Vance led the way, his old woolen uniform jacket smelling of campfire and pine pitch felt like the armor he was accustomed to living in. Behind him followed two younger rangers, Tierney, a woman whose eyes were perpetually searching for birds, and Samuel, a short but sturdy man who still believed in the efficacy of energy bars. The fog was atrocious. Visibility was reduced to a ridiculous 10 feet, forcing them to rely on instruments, ancient maps etched into memory, and barely visible trail markers. The November air, holding steady at 37 degrees Fahrenheit, tasted bitter with pine needles and wet, decaying leaves. Every breath was a gulp of cold, damp water. The signal about the missing tourists had come in before dawn while Vance was preparing coffee on his propane stove. Dispatch reported a couple who decided seasonally closed was merely a recommendation. Their sport utility vehicle was found only half a mile off the old logging road, near a weather-beaten information board. The vehicle was coated in a layer of frozen rime, looking as if it had been abandoned for a week. There was no note, no sign of struggle. Two coffee mugs sat neatly on the hood. This order, this neatness, always disturbed Vance more than obvious chaos. Chaos, he understood. Order in chaos, he did not. They moved slowly, pushing a mile deeper. The trail was choked with last year's windfalls, a mix of fallen cedars and downed oaks they had to cut through. It was there they came upon the track. It was not a typical trail. Vance stopped, raising a hand, and Tierney and Samuel froze instantly behind him.
"Quiet," he whispered, his voice sounding alien in the leaden silence.
On the slick, wet stone where water formed a small stream, they saw blood. Not drops, not splatters, but a wide, smeared streak that ran downhill, as if a bucket of red paint had been poured out. The streak indicated that something enormous and alive had been dragged with monstrous, deliberate force.
"Looks like a wounded elk, Elijah?"
Samuel asked, attempting to maintain a professional tone despite the tremor in his voice. Vance shook his head, not turning around.
"An elk, Samuel, when wounded, snaps branches. It stumbles. It leaves scattered drops. This is..."
He dropped to one knee, ignoring the cold penetrating his wet trousers. He ran a finger along the streak, which had not yet clotted from the cold. It was thick, almost black, with dark, fibrous material mixed in. The footprints. That was what truly stopped him. They were erratic and panicked, but not chaotic. The pattern was double, deep, wide indentations, as if blades had been cut into the stone. These were claws, definitely not bear claws. A bear leaves a heel print. These prints were only from the forefoot, monstrously powerful. And they alternated with impressions disturbingly similar to human palms, matted mud with clearly defined pads of the fingers. Something, or someone, in terrible agony, was trying to push off, to crawl away, but dragging its lower body.
"Damn,"
Tierney breathed, taking a step back. She was experienced enough to know she was not looking at game. Vance, a tracking expert who read mud better than most people read newspapers, immediately grasped the dissonance. The prints were too large for a man, even the biggest, and the claws were too organized for a beast. This was something transitional, something struggling with its own body. Then came the smell. It filled his lungs. The thick, coppery scent of fresh blood was so intense, Vance momentarily tasted metal in his mouth. But beneath that familiar stench lurked something else, something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. A pungent, acrid odor he could not immediately classify. It reminded him of his youth when he worked at a slaughterhouse in the eastern part of the state. The smell of hot fat mixed with the stench of scorched moss and burning cedar. The smell of forcibly denatured, corrupted flesh.
What is that smell?
Samuel clamped his hand over his nose.
I don't know.
Vance answered honestly. He knew all the smells of the forest. Pine, ozone after the rain, rotting leaves, marten scat. But this was chemical, unnatural, as if the very air had been poisoned. The most disturbing detail was the silence. This part of the Red Canyon was always noisy. Jays nested here. Red squirrels constantly fought over cones, and the drone of the wind rushing through the pine needles was always overhead. But now there was nothing. No rustling, no birdsong, not even the normal cracking of old wood. The forest was dead. Vance looked up, trying to pierce the fog which had thickened, intent on concealing what was happening. The wind, usually fierce, was absent here, as if it too avoided this place. It was an unnatural silence that the seasoned ranger recognized as a warning. He stood on the threshold of something. He had seen many deaths, stupid, tragic, brutal. He had seen people torn apart by bears and those who fell 500 feet into the canyon. But what was happening here fit no manual. It was something out of old, foolish fairy tales. Yet it was real, leaving pools of blood and a panicked dual track behind.
We go on,
Vance said, flipping the safety off his carbine. He felt icy sweat soaking his collar.
We go very carefully. Samuel, stay close to Tierney and keep your weapons ready.
They moved along the trail, which led them downward into even thicker darkness. Each step was a painful bite into the unknown. Vance felt his decades of professional confidence melting away like rime under a morning sun that had not appeared. There was only fog, blood, and the feeling that the forest was not just watching them, but waiting for them to make a fatal choice. He knew this trail led not to rescuing a victim, but to something much older and more terrifying. A few dozen yards later, the streak ended. Blood continued to drip, but the dragging mark disappeared. The creature, whatever it was, had found the strength to stand up, though it moved with tremendous instability, leaving deep, cloven prints like a wrestler trying to walk on his toes. This was an effort of will, not physical ability.
It doesn't want to be found.
Tierney whispered.
It doesn't want us to find it.
Vance corrected.
It knows others are looking for it, and we are walking directly between two fires.
He lifted his head. He could see nothing in the dense fog hanging about 15 feet above them, but Vance felt the weight of the area. He sensed a growing pressure. His experience screamed at him, "Run." But his duty as a ranger, his lifelong habit of seeing things through, forced him forward, toward the smell of burnt moss and fresh blood. He knew that what they were looking for was no longer part of the natural order of this park. They were on a boundary, and that boundary had been breached. Vance gripped the carbine stock.
We have to find out who or what this was. If it's an animal, we neutralize it. If it's a person, we give aid. But I'll tell you straight, it's neither.
He took another step. An inner instinct, which never failed him, told him they should have left the vehicle where they found it and called for aviation support. But now that they had inhaled this scent and seen these tracks, retreat was impossible. They had become part of someone else's route. Vance looked at his compass. The needle, usually stable and pointing north, was subtly twitching as if under the influence of an unknown magnetic field that should not exist in the Red Canyon. This was another dissonance, more proof that the laws of physics that governed this forest were suspended today.
Keep a 5-foot interval,
he ordered, his voice lending them a fragment of reality. But that reality was fragile, like thin ice on a puddle. They kept walking, the fog around them growing thicker, turning them into 3 lonely small figures lost in a giant, hostile grayness. Vance felt his heart pound, beating the slow, inevitable rhythm of approaching dread. The trail led them to a place that looked like a natural trap, a narrow rock fissure wedged between 2 gigantic boulders that seemed to have been dropped here by a primeval giant. At the base of the fissure was a vile mixture of meltwater, last year's pine needles, and reddish clay mud. It was here, in this damp, cold and wind-sheltered spot, that it lay.
Holy God,
Samuel whispered, his hand shaking on his rifle forearm. Vance leaned his back against the cold stone and slowly exhaled. His heart, which had been pounding, suddenly calmed, settling into a steady combat rhythm. He always knew that the strongest fear comes not at the moment of encounter, but at the moment of anticipation. Now that he saw it, fear gave way to professional assessment. The creature. It was impossible to call it a man, though there was too much human in it to call it a beast. It lay curled in a fetal position, trying to make itself as small as possible. Ragged, mud-splattered khaki trousers, which once belonged to a tourist, clung to its powerful, unnaturally muscular thighs. On its back, around the shoulder blades, stiff gray fur grew through the torn jacket fabric in clumps. The flesh was broken, the spine was arched at an impossible angle. The most terrifying detail was the contrast between the incredible animal power felt in every strained muscle and the absolute human vulnerability. The creature was breathing heavily, each inhale a whistling, tormented sound that drew its last strength. A deep, terrible wound crossed its ribs right to left. Vance, quickly assessing it from 10 feet away, knew it was not a scratch or a bear claw mark. The wound was clean. It had deep, even edges, as if inflicted by a specialized tool or a perfectly sharpened blade. This was an injury meant to destroy, not the result of a chaotic struggle. It was professional. Slowly, the creature raised its head. The fog swallowed sound, but Vance heard Tierney gasp behind him. The eyes. The eyes were not those of a wild beast. They were human. Yellowish, feverish, full of almost unbearable pain. Yet they contained a clarity, a consciousness. There was no madness of a cornered wolf, but only an overwhelming animal desire to crawl away, to hide. And that desire was not aimed at escape into the open, but at burrowing into the densest, most impenetrable shadow of the fissure.
It is wounded,
Vance said quietly, holding his carbine ready. He spoke mostly to himself, trying to fit what he saw into the framework of familiar logic.
very badly wounded.
Tierney slowly nodded.
What do we do, Elijah? That's not a man.
We don't have a protocol for werewolves, Tierney.
Vance answered dryly.
But we have a protocol for aiding the wounded. Samuel, stand so you cover the approaches. Tierney, cover me. I'm going closer.
His rational self fought against revulsion and instinctive horror. He saw before him not a mythical monster, but a wounded being in need of help, even if that help was utterly meaningless. Vance took a slow step forward, lowering his weapon slightly, demonstrating a lack of aggression.
We are rangers,
He said in the level, low voice he used when encountering aggressive bears, a voice meant to soothe, not provoke.
We are here to help. Show me the wound.
The creature flinched, its lips, crusted with mud and saliva, parted, revealing inhuman fangs. but it did not snarl. It only emitted a low, vibrating sound that was more like a deep, guttural warning. Do not come closer, or I will do something I regret. Vance stopped about 5 feet away. Dark, viscous blood slowly oozed from the wound, cooling on the rock. He felt a surge of nausea from the scent, now stronger, the mixture of blood, mud, and that scorched cedar. Then he saw it. As the creature lifted its left forepaw, trying to push off the ground, Vance noticed an old, nearly healed scar on its forearm. It was neat and geometrically precise, not the result of an accidental cut, but a clear, burned pattern. A brand. This was not a solitary wild beast that had attacked tourists. This was something belonging to an organized structure, something that used brands and surgically precise wounds. Vance realized. A fugitive. He didn't have time to process this new, frightening thought. Samuel, unable to bear the tension, took a small step sideways. The stone under his boot shifted, letting out a loud scrape. The creature's reaction was instantaneous. Without any visible effort, despite the severe wound, it contorted itself, using its incredibly strong arms to pull itself forward. It began to corkscrew into the narrow gap between the two stones.
Stop!
Vance yelled, but it was useless. The creature moved not toward the light, not upward where visibility was better. It moved toward the densest, most impenetrable shadow. It sought not salvation in the sense of escape, but shelter in darkness, like armor. It knew it was being followed, and it knew where it was safest. Vance instinctively knew that if it disappeared into that fissure, retrieving it would be impossible. But attempting to pull it out was suicide.
Tierney, give me the rope.
As Tierney hastily unclipped a coil from her pack, Vance noticed that despite the transformation, the creature stubbornly fought to retain at least a partial human form. Its lower jaw was elongated and predatory, but its fingers, though thickened, still maintained a human shape. It would not allow itself to fully commit to the transformation.
Why isn't it fully shifted?
Tierney whispered, handing over the rope.
Control.
Vance replied, grabbing the line.
They are trained, or something else. I don't know. But it is resisting.
The creature was almost concealed. Only its rear leg, covered in gray fur, was visible. Vance quickly tied a loop and, taking a risk, threw it down, hoping to snag the leg. The loop landed precisely. Vance yanked. The creature let out a sound. This time it was not a snarl, but a short, tearing howl, full not of physical pain, but of rage at itself, at being discovered and now restrained.
Hold fast!
Vance yelled. He braced his feet against the boulder and pulled, but his effort was minuscule compared to the force drawing the rope into the shadow.
Elijah, we can't pull it out!
Samuel panicked.
We cannot abandon it.
Vance roared.
If it dies there, we lose the only key to what is happening here, and if it survives, it will come out for the first tourists it finds.
Vance knew he was not doing this for the tourists. He did this because, for the first time in years, his professional curiosity and duty were seized by a reality that defied all frameworks. He could not simply turn away from this wild, wounded mystery. The rope went taut like a string. The creature in the fissure jerked, and Vance felt the loop bite into its flesh. Then, with a monstrous effort, the creature momentarily slackened the tension, then sharply yanked again, but in a different direction. Vance understood. It was not trying to break the rope. It was looking for a leverage point to break his balance. He pulled harder. Tierney and Samuel rushed to help him, grabbing the cold, wet line. It was at that moment, at the peak of the tension, as all three strained against inhuman strength, that they heard it. A sound that froze their blood. It was not a howl. It was not a growl. It was a distant, but distinct, crack.
a sound like a dry branch snapping under weight, but it occurred where Vance knew there should be neither dry branches nor such weight. The sound came from the north, beyond the ridge, maybe 200 yards away. The wounded lycanthrope, hearing that sound, instantly ceased resistance. The rope went slack, and the creature, as if on command, began quickly pulling itself out of the fissure, moving back toward them, heavily dragging its injured side. Its eyes, now filled not just with pain, but with terror, locked onto Vance. The creature understood. What was approaching was far more frightening than 3 rangers with carbines.
They are coming.
The creature rasped, the voice low, broken, but entirely human. Vance threw the rope aside. Protocol? Forget it. Now this was a race for survival.
We are leaving, now!
The first thing Vance did, having scrambled out of the cursed fissure, was frantically reach for the technology that was supposed to be their salvation. He threw open the holster on his belt and pulled out his portable Motorola radio, tuned to the dispatch frequency.
Dispatch, this is Vance, code 4 Delta. Urgent request for extraction. We have a wounded... No, not a tourist. An object. Classification unknown. I repeat, we need immediate support, preferably air support. Coordinates, 3345 set.
The radio crackled. An unusual static hiss, as if someone had tossed a handful of sand into the speaker. Then, instead of the dispatcher's voice, a low, vibrating hum broke through. It was loud, insistent, and being generated directly inside the device. Vance cursed. He tried to switch the frequency to the neighboring patrol working the southern sector, but the result was the same. Hum, crackle, and dead silence. The radio communication had not simply been interrupted. It had been jammed.
I have a satellite phone.
Samuel quickly said, trying to retrieve his personal device from its waterproof case. He dialed a number, but the phone could not find a network. The screen displayed an empty, ominous symbol.
Electromagnetic anomaly,
Vance muttered. He had heard of it before, in old park legends about evil places where compasses went mad and batteries died. But this had never been so absolute. They were cut off. At that moment, through the thick static still oozing from his radio speaker, a fragment of a voice broke through. Distorted, as if the speaker were underwater, but Vance recognized the frequency. It was the patrol working much further away in the Black Creek area.
They are moving. Too fast. Ask why they are ignoring 4. No, 5. They bypassed the perimeter. Tell them we won't hold. We won't.
The voice ended in a scream. Not a scream of pain, but an exclamation of pure animal shock. Then, again, the dead, leaden silence, which was worse than any noise.
Who was that?
Tierney asked, her face pale green beneath the layer of fog.
Ranger Quinn.
Vance replied, feeling a cold wave of panic rise within him. Quinn was a tough man, a former Army scout. If he was screaming in shock, things were very bad. Vance spun toward the wounded creature. It stood, leaning against one of the boulders, hunched over, its eyes fixed in the direction from which the crackle had come.
Are they close?
Vance asked. The creature breathed heavily.
They are here. They do not need roads.
Vance felt them. Did not see them, did not hear them, but felt them. A tremor in the earth. It was not a strong shaking, like a minor collapse or earthquake. It was a rhythmic, heavy thud, as if a giant but incredibly disciplined drummer were keeping time. The sound approached with incredible speed, ignoring the terrain.
We can't carry it, Elijah,
Samuel said.
It weighs over 300 pounds. We will die here.
Vance looked at the injured creature. If they left it, it would become bait, and they would become its continuation. If they took it, their speed would drop to 0.
We carrieth,
Vance said.
He made the decision with that cold clarity that only comes at a critical moment.
we do not abandon the wounded, ever.
He quickly pulled a spare tarp and several yards of nylon webbing from his pack.
Improvise a drag sled. Tierney, you pull from the front. Samuel, you from the back. I will cover and watch the tracks.
They worked quickly, binding the creature, which did not resist but looked at them with an expression mixed with gratitude and deep, sad knowledge. It knew they had signed their death warrant. As soon as the drag sled was ready, Vance looked north. The fog seemed to have an edge. They moved west toward an old fire lookout post 2 miles away, beyond a dry riverbed. That was their only hope for any kind of shelter. Vance walked last, his attention fixed on the ground. In the wet mud, next to their fresh footprints, he saw them. Fresh prints. Deep, indicating immense weight, but unlike the fugitives' erratic, panicked tracks, these were perfectly even. The steps were measured, taken at identical intervals, showing no sign of fatigue or panic. This was not a pack scattered in chaos. This was a formation.
They are following us,
Vance whispered.
and they are not rushing because they know where we are going.
He counted at least 4 pairs of tracks. They were not trying to bypass them. They were following directly in their wake. But the most terrifying thing about them? They were perfectly superimposed on their own. This indicated either incredible caution and knowledge of the terrain or inhuman speed, allowing them to catch up, then slow down so as not to spook them. Vance looked at the lycanthrope. The wounded creature, dragging heavily on the sled, tried to raise its head, but its strength failed it.
You know them,
Vance said, lowering his voice to a whisper so the younger rangers, who were straining to pull the load, would not hear.
Who are they?
The creature opened its eyes. With an effort that tore at its throat, it squeezed out,
The Arca, the Archons, they do not forgive. Choice,
Choice?
mercy.
The creature rasped and sank back into a semi-conscious state. Vance gritted his teeth. Mercy. So the fugitive had not merely escaped. It had committed a transgression against their code, showing a weakness that now needed to be washed away with blood. And they, the Rangers, were now part of that process. He pulled his global positioning system navigator from his pocket, which ran on its own power and did not depend on satellite communication. He quickly keyed in the coordinates of the old fire lookout, then folded the device away.
We hold direction southwest, he yelled. Tierney, avoid open spaces.
They sped up. Every yard was a struggle. The sled snagged on roots, and the fog became a physical impediment. Vance felt the forest had changed. He had always loved this forest for its unpredictability, its wild temperament. But now the forest was tense. It was saturated with tension, like an over-tightened string. They covered another 100 yards when Samuel suddenly stopped.
Something is there, he said.
He said, pointing toward a stand of fir trees. Vance strained his vision. The fog played with shadows.
What?
Movement. Like a shadow, but it doesn't match the light.
Vance knew Samuel was not fantasizing. Samuel was a pragmatist. He raised his rifle. If these were Archons, they would not hide like bears. They would wait.
Tierney, keep moving. Samuel, follow me.
They circled the firs. Nothing. Only wet stones and low-hanging branches. But Vance felt they had just walked past someone or something that was so motionless and quiet that its presence was absorbed by the environment. He glanced at the sled. The wounded lycanthrope, having heard or felt the approach, took a short, sharp breath, as if preparing to jump, but its body refused to obey. Its gaze shifted from the Rangers, full of compassion and fear, to the forest, full of cold, methodical retribution. Vance made the final decision. They would not abandon it, because abandoning it now meant becoming the next target, isolated and weakened. The forest demanded their presence. It demanded them as witnesses. They continued moving, dragging their monstrous burden through the November mud. Vance knew he was no longer a ranger. He was a participant in someone else's horrible, carefully choreographed ritual. Moving with the wounded creature was agonizing. Elijah, alternating with Samuel, dragged the improvised sled, and he felt the weight. Not just the physical weight of the half-man, half-beast, but the weight of this frightening, absurd reality, pressing down on his shoulders, blurring the line between law, order, and primal, inexplicable horror. Each step was a painful reminder that they had broken all protocols, becoming nurses for a cornered monster. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing a view of dense thickets of juniper and low-growing pines clinging to the rocky slope. The air became even colder, dropping to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and moisture instantly crystallized on logs and stones. Vance carefully watched the pursuers' tracks. He noticed something that made him freeze and order the group to stop. The tracks multiplied, but they were always positioned along the sides of their own trail. Never directly in the center, never encroaching on their personal space. It was like an invisible escort. The hunters allowed them to move, prodding them like shepherds driving sheep, rather than attacking head-on. This was a game, or worse, a procession.
They don't want to kill us.
Tierney whispered, having also noticed the strange track placement.
Not yet.
They want us to go where they need us.
Vance corrected. They encountered a gigantic fallen oak that lay across the trail, forming a natural, almost impassable obstacle. They had to spend 10 minutes dragging the sled over its trunk. Inspecting the oak, Vance found fresh tracks of the pursuers. Instead of jumping or circling this giant trunk, which was at least 5 feet high, they had passed under it. Vance saw a narrow gap between the trunk and the ground where no boot or claw mark was visible, yet the wet earth was perfectly compressed. They passed through a gap that was absolutely impassable for creatures of their size, without a single snag or sound. This required unnatural flexibility and monstrous discipline. Vance felt his breathing falter. These were not animals. This was a monstrous military operation disguised as savagery.
This is not a pursuit for the sake of killing.
Vance repeated, his voice barely audible.
This is an escort to an execution ground, and they are using us to deliver the victim.
The wounded lycanthrope, who periodically regained consciousness, sensed its masters were close. Its body began to tremble with pain, and Vance saw the muscles in its back contract. It instinctively restrained a full transformation. Its bones under the skin seemed too long, too powerful, but it fought to maintain a human outline.
Why won't you shift completely?
Vance asked when they stopped to re-bandage the wound. Vance used his field kit, applying antiseptic. The blood continued to ooze slowly, but he had tightened the compression bandage sufficiently. The lycanthrope's eyes met Vance's for a moment. They held an expression of plea and shame.
Full shift,
The creature swallowed.
is forbidden. If they find me in full form, it is a disgrace. The execution must be clean.
Vance grasped the depth of this horror. The creature was not just running from death, it was running from shame. Their organization had rules even for their own savagery. This was a code of honor, monstrous and ancient, and the fugitive was trying to avoid not punishment, but the ritual humiliation that would follow a public loss of control.
You broke a rule?
I left witnesses.
The lycanthrope whispered.
They should have been removed. I could not.
Vance felt cold despair.
The tourists?
The creature did not answer, but its gaze was eloquent. Vance understood. It had refused to eliminate the missing tourists, and for this, it was severely punished, then released to orchestrate this horrible spectacle of pursuit.
So they removed them? A deep, low nod.
Vance looked at Samuel and Tooney. They dragged their burden, unaware that their object of salvation had saved the lives of those who now met their undeserved retribution at the hands of the pursuers. Their path continued to loop, leading them deeper into an area Vance knew as the Dead Tongue, a winding trail that ended in a cul-de-sac at sheer 300-foot cliffs. Why did their instinct, or worse, the fugitive's instinct, lead them there?
Elijah, why are we taking this path?
Tooney asked, wiping sweat from her brow.
We could go to the old logging road. It's flatter.
The cover is better here.
Vance lied, trying to convince himself. In reality, he felt he was being lured. They were puppets in the hands of the pursuers, who knew how a man thinks and knew where a wounded animal would lead them. They walked the Dead Tongue for about an hour. Vance noticed that despite their attempts to move as quietly as possible, the pursuers did not fall behind. Sometimes, at the edge of his vision, he saw a slight movement in the dense fir thicket. It was too fast, too elusive to be human. His hand involuntarily reached for his knife. He realized that his rifle, his radio, his 20 years of experience, all were useless against the monstrous, organized force that controlled the very landscape.
Samuel, Tierney,
Vance said.
When we reach the post, we don't relax. We barricade ourselves and prepare to fight.
He did not know what they would fight against. Monsters? Or an army? They emerged into a small open area. Vance looked around. No tracks. But silence. Again, that ringing, oppressive silence, which meant the danger had not gone away, but simply gone dormant. They dragged the sled through a stream where the water was icy, and Vance felt his knees beginning to numb. He looked at the fugitive, who emitted a weak, almost human moan.
Hold on,
Vance muttered.
We are almost there.
He was lying. He knew almost there meant at the end of a dead end. And he understood that this cul-de-sac had been chosen not by them, but by those who followed. The true horror was that they were voluntarily walking toward their own execution, dragging their victim like obedient slaves. Vance gritted his teeth. He should change the route. He should find a bypass. But any attempt to deviate from this invisible, predetermined path felt impossible, as if invisible walls guided their movement, and any deviation would be perceived as direct disobedience. And then he saw their goal. The old fire lookout post appeared through the branches. It stood on a small hill, massive, built of thick logs. Hope, fragile and almost unbelievable, pricked him. If they could get there, if they could barricade themselves. But hope quickly shattered. Vance saw something near the entrance, something that was too static and too correct for the forest. It was the remains. The light filtering through the thick screen of morning fog was faint and sickly, but it was enough to make out the outlines of the log fire lookout post. As they approached, Vance, moving with maximum caution, saw something that made his stomach clench. Next to the post, in an area that should have been perfectly clear since it was a fire perimeter, lay the remains. It was the missing tourists. Vance stopped the group, raising his hand.
Leave the sled here. Do not move. Samuel, Tierney, stay put.
He approached slowly, trying not to take his eyes off the surrounding fir thicket. The pursuers, if they were there, were utterly invisible. The tourists, a man and a woman, lay slightly off the trail, covered by carelessly tossed fir branches. Their bodies were not gnawed, not torn apart in a wild struggle. They were neat, except for one detail: their heads. Both bodies were neatly, almost surgically decapitated. The heads lay about a foot from the bodies, turned face up, eyes wide open and frozen in an expression of final, horrible realization. Vance felt a shiver run through him. This was not the fugitive's work. The fugitive, as he knew, was wounded and weak, and by its own admission, it had refused to eliminate the witnesses. These tourists were removed by those who came later. The murders were methodical, committed with a single goal: route clearance. Vance knelt, examining the area. No signs of struggle, no blood except for what was on the neck. The decapitation was done quickly and cleanly, as if with a single sweep of a huge, razor-sharp tool. The bodies were covered with fir branches, like garbage to be hidden from sight, but not too carefully, so that it might serve as a lesson. This methodical horror shook Vance more profoundly than the sight of the lycanthrope itself. This was not savagery. This was strategy. The people were merely an obstacle to be eliminated with minimal effort and maximum demonstrative effect. Vance returned to his crew. He did not tell Tierney and Samuel the details.
They did not survive,
he said, his voice dry and harsh.
This was done by those following us. Quickly, we have to get inside.
They pulled the sled up, leaving the fugitive in the shadow of a log, and headed toward the post. The post, built of massive, thick logs, was their only hope. But the doors were locked. Vance rattled the handle. The lock was old, heavy.
Locked.
Samuel said, breathing heavily.
The key should be under the stone,
Vance muttered, but he knew it was pointless. They were in a closed zone, and he had the keys.
Is someone inside?
Tierney asked. Vance circled the building, pressing his ear against the cold log. Silence. No one was inside. But the lock was secured.
It's a trap,
Vance realized.
They knew we would come here, and they locked us out.
Samuel, without waiting for an order, circled the building, trying to find a back door or a window. He was young, full of energy and a desperate desire to act.
I'll try the attic hatch. There seems to be one.
He yelled, moving along the wall where thick moss concealed the base of the logs. Vance felt a rising anxiety.
Samuel, stop! Stay near the wall!
But it was too late. Samuel took a large step to round the corner and stumbled. The ground beneath his feet gave way with a soft, sickening crunch. His scream echoed off the nearby cliffs. It was not a cry of pain, but a sudden, choking gasp of shock, instantly cut short. Vance rushed to the breach. There was a pit, deep, about 6 feet, dug out and camouflaged with fir branches and sod so skillfully that it was impossible to spot. And at the bottom jutted sharpened steel rebar spikes, arranged to catch a man walking upright. Samuel lay there, his body impaled in several places. Death was instantaneous and horrific. Vance recoiled. He stared at the pit trap, this terrible artifact of human ingenuity designed to destroy a person. This was not an animal snare. This was a trap calculated for the knowledge of ranger tactics, knowing they would look for a secondary entrance.
They knew,
Tierney whispered, her voice thin as ice.
They know everything,
Vance replied, looking at Samuel's dead body, which was now a mangled sack. Vance, shaking with rage and cold horror, began pulling out the body. It took an agonizing 15 minutes, and each time he touched Samuel, he felt his own belief in order crumbling. When he laid Samuel's body on the wet ground next to the sled, Vance understood. This was not just a trap for him. It was a warning. Their human knowledge of the forest was now being used against them, and they were surrounded by professionals who, while adopting animal form, thought like strategists. He looked at the locked door of the post. They were not going to allow them shelter. They wanted them to stand in the open, isolated. Vance wiped the mud from his face. All he had left was Tierney and the wounded lycanthrope. He walked over to the fugitive, who had watched everything with inhuman calm, as if attending someone else's funeral.
They wanted us to see that.
Vance said.
They want us to understand that even your savagery is controlled.
The lycanthrope closed its eyes, agreeing. Vance felt they were in the center of a monstrous, meticulously staged scene. They were not fighting nature. They were fighting a cult. Vance pulled a crowbar from his pack. If the door was locked, he would break it down. They would not stand in the open. He placed the crowbar against the wooden door frame, and at that moment, an image flashed in his mind. Dozens, hundreds of eyes, watching them from the fir thickets. If he started breaking the door now, it would be perceived as an act of aggression.
No, Vance said aloud. We won't give them an excuse.
He turned to Tierney, who stood paralyzed by shock and grief.
Tierney, you take everything we have left and we move on. The post is a trap. They expect us to be here. We have to find a place they haven't planned for.
But deep down he knew no such place existed. They were on someone else's chessboard, and every move they made was predetermined. Their stop at the locked post was short, but it marked a breaking point. Samuel's death, brutal and methodical, drove out Vance's remaining hope for rescue and replaced it with cold, almost mechanical resolve. They were no longer running from a wild beast. They were running from a discipline more terrifying than any rage. They moved along the slope, leaving behind the bodies of Samuel and the tourists, who were physical evidence of an alien, inhuman court. Vance knew he could not return for them until it was clear what these forces were. For now, he had to focus on the burden. Tierney, though on the verge of hysteria, held steady. Her movements were sluggish, but she continued to pull the sled. Vance stopped to check the fugitive's wound. The creature lay still, its human eyes following Vance's every movement with clinical attention. Vance felt time was running out, and he needed to learn everything he could before the finale arrived. While cleaning the wound, Vance closely examined the creature's back. The fur grew in patches, and through it emerged pale skin scarred with lines. These were not random scars. They were perfectly parallel lines, deep but even. They were inflicted by something long and flexible, like a whip, and inflicted many times.
These aren't injuries, Vance said quietly. These are lash marks. Punishment.
The creature slowly nodded.
A demonstration for me and for others.
Why?
The creature closed its eyes, as if recalling something very painful. Vance applied the bandage to the wound, and the creature, despite the obvious pain, made no sound. This level of self-control was chilling. Suddenly, the lycanthrope gathered its remaining strength and rasped out words. The language was unintelligible, guttural, but contained sounds reminiscent of old Germanic or Scandinavian dialects. It sounded like a hymn or an oath. And at the end of this tirade, delivered with incredible effort, one word emerged, pure English, released like a sigh of relief.
Forgave.
Vance froze.
You said forgave?
Yes.
The lycanthrope whispered.
They ordered me to remove the witnesses. I found them, the tourists. They were trembling with fear. I should have eliminated them, but I saw their eyes. Human. I remembered. I could not. I let them go.
You showed mercy, Vance realized.
It is called the transgression.
The lycanthrope corrected.
The worst. Lost control, lost purpose, broke the code.
Vance understood. The fugitive had not merely run away. It had violated the rule of their organization. Their organization demanded absolute, predatory pragmatism. Any sign of human weakness, whether compassion or preserving life, was punished demonstrably. Its wounds, its suffering, these were not battle scars. This was a punishment inflicted for the purpose of demoralization and a demonstration of authority. And then, it was released.
They let you go,
Vance said, his voice full of revulsion.
So I would run. so they would catch me in front of others, to show that mercy is not weakness, it is betrayal.
Vance glanced back at Tierney. She had not heard the conversation, but her face was distorted by exhaustion and anxiety.
Our entire route,
Vance muttered.
from the beginning to that post, it was a planned corridor.
Yes,
The lycanthrope confirmed.
they are leading me to the amphitheater, the throat of the wind. That is where the conclusion always happens.
They used us as carriers.
Vance said quietly. Cold despair pierced him. They were not saving a victim. They were unwitting participants in a complex ritualistic drama. Their lives were irrelevant as long as they served as part of the performance. The deaths of Samuel and the tourists were not just route clearance. They were a demonstration of power, a reminder that this organization controlled both men and monsters. Vance quickly rebandaged the wound and stepped back. He felt neither gratitude nor compassion for the creature, only fatigue from this monstrous, bureaucratic cruelty.
What happens at the throat of the wind?
The conclusion.
The lycanthrope repeated.
I must assume the form. They will do it quickly and cleanly.
It added, as if reading Vance's thoughts.
They need you as witnesses to ensure the news spreads, that even rangers cannot interfere with their order.
Vance swallowed. He was old. He had seen too much. But the idea that he was meant to become the herald of a lycanthrope cult sparked a surge of anger in him.
We are not going where you want,
Vance said, addressing the empty forest. He ordered them to move on. Now they were not looking for salvation. They were looking for a point where they could fight on their own terms. But he knew this was self-deception. Every action they took would be part of the Archon's plan.
Change direction,
Vance told Tierney.
We head east. We try to descend to the old mine shaft.
He felt the lycanthrope flinch.
There
The creature hesitated.
are their old paths. Very dangerous.
Dangerous for us or dangerous for them?
Vance asked.
For everyone.
Was the reply.
But if I stray from the predetermined path, they will accelerate the process.
Vance nodded. So he would play by their rules, but try to buy time. They changed course. The fog slowly began to retreat, and Vance saw that the sun was finally breaking through the gray clouds, but its light was weak, sickly.
Keep going. The mine is our last chance.
Vance said. He felt they had covered about 6 miles since the beginning of this monstrous chase. But those miles were only a spatially stretched corridor intended to lead them to the inevitable point of conclusion. Vance gripped his rifle. His fingers on the trigger guard were white with tension. He sensed his brain, accustomed to protocols and instructions, was now working at its limit, trying to calculate the moves of an inhuman yet logically flawless adversary. They were walking along a steep, rocky slope, and every step Tierney and Vance took required superhuman effort. It was then, as they passed a group of fallen, rotting aspens, that Vance saw the tracks again. The tracks were no longer on the sides. They crossed their path, moving to intercept, and there were more of them. Not 4, but perhaps 6 or 7. They had sped up. They were no longer leading them. They were intercepting. The mine was closed. The amphitheater was open. The game was over.
Tierney,
Vance said.
change direction, west again, to the throat of the wind. We play by their rules.
He did not know why he made this decision. Perhaps he was simply tired of fighting the inevitable. But he understood that if he was going to die, he wanted to die facing them, not running away with his back turned. The lycanthrope on the sled emitted a low, guttural sound, like relief. Vance felt like a betrayer. He was leading his colleague Tierney directly into the jaws of the ritual. But there was no other choice. The final stretch of the journey to the place the fugitive called Throat of the Wind was the most grueling. They moved through a canyon that was a labyrinth of narrow, winding mountain passes. The sun, which finally broke through the fog, brought no warmth. On the contrary, it only emphasized the icy temperature, which was now exactly 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind whistled through the narrow passes with an eerie musical intonation that spoke of coming misfortune. The air here was saturated with the smell of wet limestone and rust. Long ago, in the 1940s, geologists worked here, and Vance saw pieces of abandoned, time-darkened tools covered in rusty decay. This metallic, acrid smell, mixing with the scent of cold, wet earth, created the feeling that they were walking over an ancient, abandoned battlefield. The sled with the lycanthrope moved almost silently. The creature was completely weakened, sinking into a state close to a coma. Only its feverish eyes, full of yellow fire, remained open, fixed on the surrounding cliffs. Vance's radio, which he kept switched on, suddenly came to life. But it was not a human voice, nor static. It was a low, monotonous tone that pulsed at a constant frequency, like the beat of a metronome. It was barely audible, but could be felt in the chest.
What is that?
Tierney asked, her voice hoarse.
They have located us,
Vance whispered.
They are using some kind of signal to control their movements, or to let us know they are here.
The pulsation grew stronger as they moved deeper into the canyon. Vance felt his head begin to ache from the monotonous, persistent sound. It was a psychological weapon that said, "We know where you are, and we are not rushing." They entered the place known as the Throat of the Wind. It was a semicircular, natural amphitheater of black, layered slate. It was immense, about 200 yards across, and the slate walls rose hundreds of feet, forming a perfect acoustic trap. Vance knew that in this place, sound was instantly absorbed or, conversely, distorted, making communication impossible. It was the ideal spot for a ritual where no unnecessary noise should interfere. In the center of the amphitheater was a perfectly flat, circular rock platform. It looked unnaturally smooth compared to the rest of the jagged terrain. The fugitive, bloodied and nearly breathless, raised its head. It looked directly at that platform. In its eyes was not terror, but knowledge.
This is it,
Vance whispered.
This is their place.
He ordered Tierney and himself to take cover behind a huge moss-covered boulder that lay on the periphery of the amphitheater. As soon as they took positions, Vance looked up and saw them, the first figures of the pursuers. They stood on the upper ridges of the cliffs surrounding the amphitheater. They were not hiding, not camouflaging. They stood perfectly still, blending with the gray slate and the remnants of fog clinging to the peaks. There were perhaps 8 or 10 of them, and they were in full animal form. Their bodies were immense, over 7 feet tall, covered in thick, dark, almost black fur that absorbed the remnants of daylight. They were massive, predatory, but their placement was impeccable. A perfect semicircle around the perimeter of the canyon, ensuring complete coverage. There was no weak spot, no point where escape was possible. Vance, who until this moment had been fighting dread, encountered something new, fear of this monstrous, cold discipline. These creatures had none of the rage he expected from a wild beast. They had purpose.
They are waiting,
Tierney whispered, pressing against the stone.
They are not waiting,
Vance corrected.
They are observing. We are their audience.
His hand involuntarily squeezed the grip of his carbine. If it were a bear, he would know how to act. But how do you shoot something that looks like a nightmare but moves with the precision of clockwork? He raised his rifle. In the scope, he saw one of the figures on the ridge. Clear outlines of the snout, incredibly powerful shoulders. The creature was absolutely motionless. Only its yellow eyes slowly scanned the amphitheater. Vance could not pull the trigger. He knew that shooting one would set all of them in motion, and that would be the end. He understood. Any action on their part would be a provocation, not a defense. They must remain unseen and silent. Meanwhile, the pursuers approached the base of the rock platform where the fugitives stood. They stopped about 10 feet away from it, forming a tight, motionless semicircle. The fugitive, now fully shifted, a huge gray lycanthrope, stood trembling from weakness and blood loss, but its head was bowed. It waited. At that moment, one of the pursuers, standing closest, made a gesture that was not a threat, but a command. A short, barely perceptible nod of the head. That gesture was not addressed to the fugitive. It was addressed to something standing on the platform before them. The fugitive stopped trembling. It inhaled deeply, and its massive lungs filled with cold, damp air. It had accepted its fate. Its eyes, now entirely bestial but still holding that same human clarity, looked directly at Vance, who was hiding behind the boulder. It was not a call for help, but a farewell.
I can't watch this.
Tuny whispered, covering her face with her hands.
You will watch.
Vance whispered back, his voice devoid of emotion.
Because if you turn away, they will know we are here.
He forced himself to look. The 4 nearest pursuers stood perfectly straight. None of them displayed aggression. This was not a meeting of wild predators, but a meeting of members of a disciplined organization where rules meant more than instinct. The largest of them, the one who had nodded, now slowly stepped forward. Its claws were thick as knives, and they emanated an aura of absolute, unbreakable authority. This was clearly the leader. It made no sound. It simply stood before the fugitive, whose head was now bowed to the ground. The tension was monstrous. Vance felt the pulsation coming from the radio intensify, beating the rhythm of this inhuman judgment. The leader slowly raised a forepaw. The fugitive finally made a sound. It was a low, mournful howl, full of confession of guilt. A howl like a condemned warrior acknowledging the justice of the sentence. That sound was the last. Vance knew what was about to happen, and he could do nothing but bear witness. He was a ranger, a protector of nature, and now he was a part of someone else's horrible law. The leader lowered its paw. There was no rage, no tearing. There was only monstrous, cold discipline that transformed this execution into something more terrifying than any savage killing. Silence did not return to the amphitheater instantaneously. It returned when the leader, or Archon, as the fugitive called it, brought its paw down, and a sound like a wet, short clap echoed in the air. The light filtering through the clouds was dim, but it was enough to illuminate the central platform. Vance saw everything. The leader struck. It was not a furious tearing. It was one clean, professional slice, severing the fugitive's throat from ear to ear. The creature Vance had earlier seen as a wounded patient emitted only a short, gurgling sound. A stream of dark, thick blood hit the cold slate, freezing instantly. Death was instantaneous, surgical. It was committed not out of hatred, but out of necessity. The fugitive, now fully shifted into the beast, collapsed onto the platform. Its massive body hit the stone heavily, and the echo of that impact reverberated off the canyon walls. An absolute, oppressive silence fell. The leader stepped back, its indigo eyes watching not the dead body, but its comrades. It gave another short, barely perceptible nod. None of the 4 nearest pursuers moved. They stood like statues, observing the result. Vance, suffocating under the sense of unreality, could not believe this discipline. Even the most highly trained military unit would not demonstrate such composure after an act of such violence. The 4 pursuers slowly retreated from the platform, joining the rest. They stood in a tight semicircle, their gazes fixed not on the corpse, but on the fir thicket where Vance and Tierney were hiding. They did not move. They simply waited. Vance understood. This was not the end of the ritual. They waited for a reaction. They waited for the rangers to emerge, to try to examine the body, to intervene, to violate their monstrous order. Vance squeezed Tierney's shoulder.
Don't move. Not a sound.
He felt his heart pound a frantic rhythm in his chest. He held his rifle ready but knew it was useless. They were surrounded, and any aggression on their part was suicide. They sat there for perhaps 10 minutes while the dead lycanthrope lay in the center of the arena, a silent reproach and an ominous trophy. Blood continued to drain from the platform, forming a small, dark pool on the stone. Then the leader made one last movement. It turned and began to ascend the slopes back up. The second followed it, then the third. They did not look at the humans. They made no sound. They moved as organized as they had arrived, disappearing into the twilight that was beginning to settle in the canyon. Their huge, black silhouettes dissolved into the gray slate, as if they had never been there. The last one to reach the crest paused. It was one of the smaller ones, originally positioned on the periphery. It looked directly toward the boulder where Vance and Tierney were hiding. Vance knew it was looking right at him. In the creature's eyes was neither malice nor triumph. There was only cold, absolute emptiness. It was a gaze that said, "We know who you are, we know what you saw, and we allow you to leave." Then it vanished. Vance waited. He waited for the next step, the hidden trap, the ambush. He waited for a scream that would signify their end. But the forest was empty. The pulsating tone in the radio ceased, and silence returned. But now that silence was not merely the absence of sound, but the heavy, absolute silence of order. The tension holding Vance snapped. He slumped onto his knees. His body, strained for the last 6 hours, suddenly gave out. He smelled the acrid scent of blood and gunpowder, which mixed with the scent of fresh, damp moss. Tierney, sobbing, clung to the stone.
They left?
Yes,
Vance answered, his voice hoarse.
they finished. They left.
He forced himself to stand. He walked on trembling legs to the central platform. The dead, transformed body lay there, enormous and pathetic. Its eyes were open, frozen in an expression of deep, almost philosophical peace. It met its conclusion, as it had wanted, cleanly and quickly. Vance looked at it, and his heart filled not with fear, but with pure, icy sorrow. He had seen wild animals kill for hunger or territory, but he had never seen monsters kill for a code of honor, with such discipline and method. He did not touch the body. He knew this was not their territory, and they had no right to clean up. They were left alive, not saved, but left, because their presence, their testimony, was part of the ritual. They were supposed to tell the tale. Vance looked at Tierney, who was slowly recovering.
We gather everything we can, and we leave, and we will never, ever come back here.
He looked back at the cliff ridges. They were empty, but he felt they were still there, watching, waiting. They sat there, the remaining 2 rangers, for an hour or more, expecting an attack, a scream, or any other sign that the performance was not over. But the forest returned to normal, as if it had never gone out of order. The cold wind that had avoided the amphitheater during the ritual now whistled through the pine needles. The first owl called, its voice sharp and absolutely mundane. Somewhere in the thickets, a mouse rustled. The forest was clear. Clear of tension, clear of horror, as if someone had wiped a slate clean. Elijah Vance, leaning against the boulder, drank cold water from his canteen. The taste was bland, but he felt it with an almost unbearable sharpness. He looked at Tierney, who sat curled up, her eyes empty and sightless.
We need to move,
Vance said, standing up. His legs were wobbly, but his mind was razor sharp.
right now.
They left the amphitheater, leaving the dead, transformed body in the center of the rock platform. Vance felt no remorse. It was not their concern. Their concern was to survive and keep this secret, which was now sealed in their memories. A mile later, as they exited the zone of the electromagnetic anomaly, Vance's radio suddenly came back to life, clearing the static.
Vance, do you copy? This is dispatch. Are you online? We have complete data loss on your coordinates. Where the hell are you?
Vance picked up the radio. His voice was steady, without a tremor. The voice he used when talking about routine, about the forest he knew.
Dispatch, this is Vance. We are exiting the Red Canyon. We have an emergency situation. Samuel and the missing tourists did not survive. Difficult terrain, weather conditions. We were attacked by a large, unidentified predator. Tierney requires immediate evacuation and medical attention.
He was lying. The lie came easily.
A predator? A bear?
No, larger. We neutralized it. Vance lied. But we need assistance.
He knew that the official reports would mention an accident on difficult terrain. Volumes would be written about the attack by a large, unidentified predator that was destroyed. The complete loss of radio communication due to anomalous solar activity would be cited. No one would dig deeper. No one would believe the story of disciplined monsters conducting rituals of honor in the mountains. They reached the old logging road, and soon Vance saw the lights of an approaching rescue jeep. As they got into the vehicle, Tierney, who had been silent the entire time, looked at Vance.
Elijah, what do we tell them?
We tell them what we are told to tell them, Tierney.
Vance answered.
And what we saw, we forget. Or we keep it. But it must never leave our heads. Otherwise, they will return.
His words were not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The following days were filled with interrogations, medical examinations, and Samuel's funeral. Vance held steady. He was the senior ranger. He knew how to weather a tragedy. He answered all questions with cold, iron precision. But he could no longer sleep. Elijah Vance returned to his clean, logical home 200 miles from the mountains, now felt like a stranger. He sat up in his chair at night, looking at the empty street. He was tormented not by the thought of the monsters he had seen. He was tormented by the thought of the incredible, cold structure that lurked in the forest and commanded death. He realized that the most frightening thing about what he witnessed was not their ability to kill. It was their capacity for absolute control. They were not wild beasts. They were a society hidden from human eyes, with their own code, their own hierarchy, their own rituals of punishment. They demanded discipline even in their animal form. Vance began to see the world differently. He looked at politicians, at the military, at corporations, and it seemed to him that he saw only a thin film hiding something much older and more organized. If they could maintain such order within their own savagery, then what did they consider true chaos? And how far were they willing to go to prevent it? Vance knew he had survived not by chance. He was a pawn left alive to tell his story, so that humanity, which considered itself the master of this planet, would know that beyond the boundaries of their perception, in the deepest places, another law existed. And that law, based on absolute order and monstrous strength, was ready to destroy anyone who showed weakness. Vance walked to the window. The night was cold, about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at the trees in his garden. He knew they were watching. Not him personally, but the territory. His life, which was now merely a report of what should be. He was a witness. And that status gave him not immunity, but eternal dread, because he knew that if he committed the transgression of mercy, if he told too much, if his testimony disrupted their order, they would return. Their discipline was not just a rule, it was a threat, penetrating the very fabric of American daily life. And Elijah Vance, the old ranger, now lived on the border of two worlds, knowing that one was a lie and the other was an inevitable, disciplined horror.